Last year, by chance, I picked up Elodie Harper's novel, The Wolf's Den. It was early 2022. I didn't know anything about it, but the cover looked interesting, and when I read the back jacket, my curiosity was piqued. Of all the books I read last year, it was perhaps one of my favorites, and in my mind, it was a masterclass in creating tension and making us, the reader, care not just about the main character and their outcome, but also in many of the other characters around them. For those of you that are new here, my name is Cameron. I'm a writer, an editor, and the creator of Wrestling with Words, a channel where we look at how we can tell better stories while also understanding how the best stories are told. The Wolf's Den is set in ancient Pompeii. Our main character and primary POV character, Amara, is a prostitute slave working in one of Pompeii's brothels, the Wolf's Den. The primary plot follows Amara as she struggles to survive under a cruel owner in an even crueler world. I really don't want to say too much more or reveal too much in any of these overviews to avoid spoiling anything. I'll try to talk as broad as I can around the edges. I found myself reading a great deal of historical fiction lately, but it isn't my go-to genre per se. This might be a me thing, but one problem that I have, and maybe others that are fans of the genre have it as well, but certain time periods and plots are just overwritten to me and feel a little bit worn out. Again, for some, they may love their espionage, World War II or Cold War era thrillers, but those just are not for me. And it feels like those kind of dominate the historical fiction genre. The same goes for period pieces set in the UK. I just feel like I've seen and heard those stories too often. My initial reaction is always a tired sigh. But that doesn't make them wrong or bad or that you shouldn't like them. That's just my personal taste. And I feel like I should let you know that off the bat. And it might be the case why I was so attracted to and enjoyed this book so much. Possibly it was purely because it was different from what I see as being mainstream historical fiction. But regardless, the main question that I sort of want to answer and talk about today, why did I love this book and why it was one of my favorite books of the year? The language in this book is pretty brutal, as one might expect taking place in a brothel. However, that doesn't mean that the imagery is over the top or explicit. The language, yes, suggestive themes really aren't. And I think that sort of helps the story because the story isn't necessarily about the work being done in the brothel, but the characters that are there and that are in this world. But this also doesn't mean that the living conditions were great or that it glorified this line of work. It may not have been cheery, but it also wasn't hyper graphic. Instead, you get a real sense of the world, the time period, atmosphere, tone, and these characters' lives living as people. Because the story itself isn't necessarily about slave prostitution or prostitution, but instead about the people and not their jobs per se. Setting is such a hard element to write and is often treated as a character in and of itself. From the mundane to the intricate workings of the city, we get a real feel for how people lived during this time period and what was important to them. On just the world and the characters alone, I think it goes to show how well studied the author was on this subject in this time period. In this novel, every character feels like they are their own main character in their own story, which is the goal of a writer. No matter if they're a minor character, the antagonist, or some variation, every character in this book has depth and a complexity to them. We understand each of their fears, goals, desires, and eventually why they are the way they are. But complexity isn't the only thing that makes the characters in this story so well written. In fact, there's a great deal of complexity in their relationship with the protagonist, Amara. We care about all these characters because Amara cares about them and how they interact with her. We truly get to know each of these characters from the perspective of Amara. When they fight with one another, we feel that. When they are getting along and enjoying their life in this awful world, we feel that pang of joy despite the looming dread of reality. The sisterhood amongst these girls is something that I haven't seen done quite as well in any other book. And it makes you love the other characters in the way that Amara loves them, despite their different backgrounds and where they're from. At its core, that's exactly what this book is about: sisterhood. I I enjoyed the book for all those elements, but I think what really stood out to me was the constant tension throughout. I love tension, and for those of you that have seen my first video, I talked a bit about how tension is that main driver for keeping a reader reading. When I read The Wolf's Den, I couldn't help but feel that never-ending pull from one page to the next, slowly building and releasing as we live through Amara. We feel how powerless she is in this world. She's incredibly sympathetic with her own tragic backstory and the relationships she's made with the other girls. We feel how badly she wants her freedom and the injustices done to her. Up to the very end of the novel, we're on the edge of our seat, wanting her to succeed, wanting her friends to succeed, wanting for a happy to this tragic story. But telling you any further or any more elements beyond that feels like I'm robbing you of the experience of reading it for yourself. And so my rating. The way I do this rating is on a 1 to 10 scale, with 5 being average and truly average, 10 being the best thing I've ever seen, and a 1 being something that I did not enjoy at all. And the overall score that I usually give a book isn't necessarily an average or a combination of the different elements that I rate. It's just sort of my overall opinion or feel. But I do like to kind of break down a couple of categories or a couple of things that I think are important to kind of rate and relay to you. For some authors or genres, I tend to gravitate or don't gravitate to them. I may enter some genres with a negative bias, or I may enter some genres with an overwhelming positive bias. Same goes for authors and whatnot. But for this, I had no expectations. So for the overall taste and bias that I had towards this book, it was a 5, totally neutral. I had not heard of it, but I think that the book was a little more popular than I initially realized when I first picked it up. But I had no expectations at all. The simplicity of the story and the pace of the plot was done very well. Despite the book being longer than I think I realized when I finished it, I really didn't feel like there was a wasted scene or wasted subplots. They all sort of built and crescendoed into each other. As I said before, the tension here wasn't necessarily tied to the story, but more so to the characters in the world. There was just that sense of unease. So even though there was tension in the plot, most of the tension was from other elements. So I gave the overall story an 8. It was simple but effective. It was a small but a pretty powerful cast of characters. Even though we only ever see the world from Amara's perspective, the other side characters are really complex, full of color and wonderfully written. Each feel as if they could have been their own main character in this story. But I think for the purpose of the story being told and for the progress of the plot, it needed to be from Amara's perspective. We care about each side character, and more specifically, we care about Amara's well-being. We want her to succeed, but at any moment, we aren't sure if she will. She is also a very competent point of view character, which makes seeing her skills and her navigate certain situations really interesting and exciting. But by no means did it feel as if she was perfectly suited for every position. I think that having an intelligent and highly competent character was what really helped keep her feel fresh and interesting and entirely sympathetic. She really encompasses everything that we kind of love about a main character, being competent and smart and charismatic. But besides her, even the villains in this story, or at least the main villain, comes off at some point or another as being sympathetic, which might turn some people away, but I always think that if you can make someone who is awful feel or be somewhat sympathetic, that it's a product of good writing and good storytelling. And again, which given who the main antagonist was, it's impressive that you can make a reader feel sympathetic towards that character. So I give the characters a rating of a 9 for this story. This is a brutal world in a brutal time period. There's no glorification of the time period or the lines of work and careers taking place. You can tell the author knew this place well and was able to transport us right into Pompeii pretty seamlessly. The dialogue and subtle world building and everything related to atmosphere was excellently done without using grand or flowery prose. I gave the world and atmosphere an overall 9. I think the overall story was easy to follow. Nothing was over the top as far as prose go, and there was tone and color to each scene. The dialogue was witty at times, while also being incredibly intense at others. And when it came to describing a place that pretty much doesn't exist any longer. The writing does a wonderful job of bringing that place back to life. I gave the prose and the overall writing an 8. I kind of leave this category here as a kind of a homage that with some stories, they might have a special something about them, or sometimes stories might get a lower rating overall, but I think that because of their impact on a certain genre or a movement or something, there might be an extra specialness to it. That's kind of what this category is. But I gave this specialness of it a 9 rating because of the tension. Every page and every interaction Amra faces and every character within this narrative creates some kind of tension. Tore through this book mostly out of fear of Amra reaching her goals, as well as the other characters for the same reason. Beyond the tension, there were other elements that make this book special. It felt like Pompeii was sort of the perfect place for this story to be told. Pompeii was kind of this melting pot of different cultures for the time, so it felt like there was a reason this was in Pompeii specifically. And there are also some interesting cameos of history that kind of pop up in the book that were interesting without spoiling anything. But they were interesting, and I thought that they were done with a level of taste and didn't feel like X historical character popped in and said hello and then left. So I thought that was really interesting. And then sort of for my overall ranking, I'd give this book a 9. This is a book that I find myself recommending to just about everybody. That's partially why I don't have my copy in front of me. I'm pretty sure I recommended the book, so I handed it off, so I don't have a copy with me. But of 2022, this was a book that was one of my favorites. Mostly because of the themes it explored, but also the tension on the page and just the great characters that were written. The humanization of the cast was something that seemed to kind of take my breath away and took me by surprise. There was just so much autonomy given to each character that you really felt for them. It's often hard to describe why a book was great and how it had such an intimate effect on you. The Wolf's Den was one of those, where I felt myself caring for the success of each character on the page, while also being enthralled with the horrible world that they lived in. The book is a trilogy, where the second book is titled The House with the Golden Door, which is now available. If historical fiction and historical women's fiction are of interest to you, or you want a new, fresh perspective on historical fiction, consider checking this book out. Please let me know what your book recommendations are, maybe what I should read and review next. For those of you that stayed to the end, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.